So yeah, my name's Adam. I recently, or not recently, I became interested in spiritual concepts and how they can relate to our lives. Probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And when I did, it kind of just clicked. In the sense that I was able to see that there's a direct connection between a lot of the more recent scientific discoveries and then a lot of the ancient and more modern spiritual concepts. This presentation is going to look at that, and we're going to see like what you can take away from the modern scientific discoveries and how they exactly relate to ancient and more modern spiritual topics. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys see my screen okay, or I'm assuming? All right, so to begin, this is practical mysticism with modern science. So the goal of this presentation is to use various scientific discoveries and rationality to provide a basic framework so that we can all begin to acknowledge that there's a presence of realms and dimensions that exist inside and outside of our own that we come in contact with and actually influence our individual realities. And that we're actually surrounded by large swaths of individuated consciousnesses that exist within our reality. And to begin with that, I think a great place to start would be to look at how our perception is very limited compared to the wide array of the electromagnetic spectrum which we exist in. So here I've put up some numbers that show the range of which our ears, our eyes, and we can taste and touch. And as you can see here, the ears are only able to hear from 20 hertz all the way to 20,000 hertz. And our eyes can see an even higher range only of 440 terahertz to around 770 terahertz. This range is basically our filter for reality. And just to take something from NASA, the amount of the EM spectrum that our eyes can see is only 0.035% of the total spectrum, which in essence means that we're completely blind to our reality. We know that we're surrounded by these wide range of frequencies, but our eyes can only see reflected light. And even then, it's only within those certain frequencies. So we could, in theory, have a being or an entity standing directly in front of us, and at best, we would see just a slight shimmer. Most of the time, we'd probably see nothing. And this brings the question, are angels named angels because they're at an angle to us? And did they know this? I think they might have. And that also brings us to in a lightless room with no external light source. When we're looking around us, we can't even see our own bodies, which means that we are reliant on an external light source to even show us what we even are. On the right here, I have a picture of the human body in a dark room when you're using a very highly sensitive camera that can detect the biophotons in the body. And then below that, over here is a picture or a painting that I've seen in the Theosophical Society in Wheaton. And it's always stood out to me as like a really good depiction of the aura. And a lot of clairvoyants say this is actually what we look like when you look at us clairvoyantly. And next thing I think we need to understand before we get into this presentation is that through the experiment called the double slit experiment, it was shown that our reality is actually influenced just by observing it. So they found that when you shot light waves through two slits, like here at the top, they expected it to create two patterns, like here on the bottom. But when there was nothing to observe the waves as they traveled through the medium until they reached this back wall, they got this distribution pattern over here where it says without an observer. This suggests that without having a detector or anything to measure the waves as they moved through the double slits on the first wall here, they were able to deduce or figure out that just the simple act of observing changes how reality plays out. And building on that, If we take into account that every cell in our body is taking in stimuli and processing it and then sending it out into the nerve endings that it's connected to, and then that signal travels along the nerve endings where it's compressed and then transported to the brain where it's understood. In actuality, things like the eyes aren't actually seeing anything, it's the visual cortex in our brain. And that means that what we see as reality is completely dependent on the filters and just how our brain interact with the environment, with each cell being essentially a filter to our reality. And with that, every time one of our cells or our collective being brings in energy from the outside environment, we're compressing that energy into the center of that cell where it's being understood, compressed, and then shared with the nervous system before reaching the brain. This act is also called implosion. And implosion is a way to transfer energy from the inside of something to the outer perimeter of everything. In this way, every time a cell compresses information and then transfers it, it's only keeping relevant information to that cell. And it's up to the greater organism's body to understand what's going on. And then finally, what is the difference between like an alive body and a dead body? Well, they say in medical field, the dead body is just the lack of vital functions like brain activity, circulation, or respiration. But you've heard the phrase of like I was dead on the table for 10 minutes, but then they came back to being alive. So what does that even mean? Well, to look at that, we're going to begin to look at that. There was a study done on a few men that were about to die, and they put what's called an EEG cap on them, where it measures brain waves and brain activity. And what they found was that at time of death or at time of near death, there was a uprise in alpha and gamma brain waves, which are correlated with um, deep memory recall and memory replayback. And they found that in deep meditators, these brain signals are actually the ones that are most prominent. And they found that as these men were dying, they created these alpha and gamma brainwaves, and these brainwaves spiked just before the total brain activity ceased. This suggests that at time of death, there is a memory recall or a life recall where we replay all the most important events in our lives, and then there appears to be some sort of upload to some sort of greater field. The spiritual implications are of this that there's a species-wide field that every mammal at least has, in which we pull information from. And this information is basically all the events that the organism survived or all the different stimuli that occurred to make it, die. But really, this species-wide field answers a lot of the questions we have about, for instance, how do dogs know to act like dogs, or they smell each other's butts, or how there was evidence to suggest that when a rat learns how to solve a maze on the east coast of the United States, a rat on the west coast is able to learn how to do it much faster. This suggests that there's a species-wide field in which information is pulled from the subconscious mind, building to allowing a species to evolve over lifetimes as opposed to just individual lives. And with that covered, I want to look at the bigger topics we're going to look at in this presentation. First, we're going to look at what is fractality, what is a plasma torus, what is transverse versus longitudinal, or sometimes called scalar waves, why do objects even fall to the ground, how do sacred geometries tie into this, how is what we call plasma inhabiting living organisms, and how does that interact with us? And then finally, I'm going to show how this adds up to give us what I'm calling the keys of the kingdom. So first, what is fractality? To put it simply, it's perfected compression. As you can see here on the right, as you divide this slinky-like shape into more and more slinkies, it's infinitely repeating and you're not losing any data whatsoever. Some of the definitions of and properties of being fractal are that it's a self-contained and self-similar unit that contains the whole within itself as an individual container. It's an infinitely repeating pattern, shape, or equation that can repeat in the microcosm and the macrocosm. They have the ability to compress information in complex ways that allow for self-similar patterns to arise without losing any of its essential structure. And here in the bottom, you can see an example of the Mandelbrot set, which is a famous fractal set where the further you go in, you would just see these repeating patterns. And on the right is a picture of our DNA from the top down. Here are some more examples of fractality. Uh, Here on the top left and middle is another version of the Mandelbrot set. As you can see, as you zoom in, you see the same repeating pattern. On the right, there's a mountain just being created out of repeating triangles. And then here on the left is showing how here on the bottom is showing how when you implode at the center of anything, you get a fractal pattern. Which leads us to the sacred geometry shape of the flower of life. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this shape, but it's shown or known to be the set of shapes that contain the entirety of the universe. And this shape is itself a fractal, as it's always composed of just one circle that's just adding to itself to create a compound complete structure. And tying into that, there's a ratio known as the phi ratio. And this ratio is approximately equal to 1.618. And it has a lot of very unique features. Because this value allows us to divide something up repeatedly, creating a self-similar reflection, it allows for fractality to arise naturally within the universe. As you can see here on the bottom left, there's a pine cone and also the galaxy. And by taking these phi ratios, you're able to maximize the amount of spin and also increase the amount of things you're able to pack inside of one region. Pine cones and galaxies use this number naturally, this ratio. And to build on that, electricity itself is a fractal pattern because electricity is always trying to find the quickest route out of any electrical system. And it usually finds it by finding a fractal path out of there. And I believe that if you take into account the electricity in the brain, this might actually account for why people in altered states of consciousness or in deep meditation or in dream states are reporting that they see fractals or repeating shapes that look like tie-dye or any of those Mandelbrot sets. Here are some more examples of how electricity actually transfers to different objects here on the Earth. Here you can see our blood vessels, some leftover water flow on the planet. Here is a river on the right, and then here in the middle is lightning to show the point. Here's another slide showing how phi is a fractal ratio. Because if you look here at this graphic on the right, you can see that line A to B is always going to be the same proportion as B to C. And if you continue that pattern, you're always going to have a self-similar segment that's equal to the previous segment times 1.618. And you can also go backwards with this. So you're always able to trace where you are in any complex chain of fractality or a fractal if you use this ratio. So you would never get lost in a large complex chain of self-similar things. And then with that, we're going to look at what is a plasma torus? Well, to put it simply, it's an electric donut. And then before we get into that, though, let's look at what plasma is. Plasma is a state of matter in which the atoms and molecules become highly energized within a collective field for an individual plasma or plasmas. The result is a mixture of positively charged ions and free electrons that are easily able to interact within their environment. Unlike other forms of matter, plasma is electrically conductive due to the presence of those charged particles. And plasma can be found in various forms in nature, including stars, lightning, auroras, and even technologies that we're beginning to use today in things like fusion reactors and even fluorescent lighting. Some of the properties of a torus is that everything within its influence is pulled through its center, and then the outside of the torus is then rotated out of the from the outer perimeter into the inside curvature and then down in towards the center again. This repeating or recursive pattern takes the information from that previous cycle around the outer perimeter, takes it into its center, and then compresses it so that it's always cycling energy in an efficient manner. The trip consists of a past, a present, and a future, where all the states of energy are in different time frames depending where they are on this path as they try to reach the center once again. The shape of a torus composes of 99.9% of the known universe, including ourselves. When they're operating efficiently, a plasma torus or a torus can be operating in the state we call negentropy or negative energy, which means that they aren't creating heat, but actually creating coldness, which is representative of extreme compression. Here's some examples of a single torus. As you can see, it cycles energy around the perimeter and then brings it back towards the center. Or here's the total geometric shape here on the bottom. Here's some more examples of toruses and how they can be representative of different things. And then returning to the flower of life, there's strong evidence to suggest that a flower of life in 3D, in 3 dimensions, is actually a plasma torus. Because if you look here on the right of this Chinese statue with the claw, you can see that the flower of life, when blown out into 3D, creates a perfect sphere with a grid pattern. And this is very special because it's believed that the center of a flower of life, or any of the circles in a flower of life or seed of life, are actually center points that lead back to the complete whole of the total field. So looking at this example, we see that this center point right here is actually a gateway to every other circle around that circle. And we'll touch on this more later. Here's another example of how a torsion field can represent all of reality, most of it. And then finally, before we move on to the next section, let's look at how plasmas can be seen to be in different modes. They can be in what's called glow mode or in dark mode. In glow mode, they're visible to the eye and they're burning a lot of energy. And this can be represented by ball lightning that's been seen occasionally, the sun, or even lightning itself. In dark mode, plasma is still in an electrically active state, but it remains invisible to our naked eyes due to the fact they're not operating in those insanely high frequencies that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And I believe that many of the entities that have been discussed throughout history and different schools of thought, such as fairies, gnomes, jinn, angels, might just be plasma entities that aren't operating in glow mode. Because in order to be in glow mode, they'd have to be burning a lot of energy, and why would they? So I think perhaps these entities are right here in front of us, just not able to be seen. And a concept that adds to this is that we've discovered something called standing waves, which are a collection of waves that create a single structure that are self-reinforcing and allow for vibration to maintain a set position. Standing waves are the result of an interference pattern that causes a reflection of waves to sustain themselves. And they don't propagate through space like traveling waves that we use for radio waves and light. A standing wave can be thought of as a mathematical or graphical representation of a torsion field. And there's evidence to suggest that even when we play music notes on like a piano or a guitar, as those notes move through the air, they are individual standing waves that are propagating through the environment, which is why we hear discrete notes because they're patterns that are represented like this. And it's actually been evidence to show that a music note actually travels through the air like a sphere of energy or a torsion field. Here's some information about how this interference can create destructive interference or constructive interference. When constructive interference occurs, the waves align, resulting in amplified intensity, and it can create a stronger wave, like a wave on top of the ocean cresting on the seashore. Destructive interference would be like two waves that are equal strength hitting each other and then canceling each other out. Both create new patterns, but only constructive interference adds to the field without subtracting. And also with that, there's a concept of octaves and harmonics in music and also in frequencies. Octaves are when you go up one octave, you double the frequency or the note. For example, if you have a fundamental frequency and you double it, you would have two times that frequency. And if you did it, I'm sorry, if you had a harmonic above that first frequency, the next set would be the second harmonic. And above that would be the third harmonic, and so on. And doubling of a frequency equals another octave. And then for a harmonic, within each octave, you have harmonic overtones. And these harmonics are integer multiples that are of the same fundamental frequency. For example, if you had the second harmonic at 2F, the third harmonic would be 3F, fourth harmonic would be 4F, and so on. Each set of these harmonics follows a fractal pattern, and this pattern repeats as you move from one octave to the next. And you can see that in this graphic here at the bottom. And with that, returning back to the phi ratio, if we take what we saw on a previous slide where phi ratio will always give you a fractal shape, if we were to take frequencies and then take a harmonic of 1.618 or phi ratio, a very interesting thing occurs. Because you are kind of drilling down smaller and smaller, you end up creating sort of a gap in between the frequencies, as you can see right here where it says phi ratio and there's this arrow. This gap might actually be why when they had the study that we talked about at the beginning of the EEG study, why it appears there actually might be a transfer of information to a morphogenic field for the species, because alpha and gamma brainwaves are actually at phi ratio to each other. And by looking at this graph, we can see there appears to be a tunnel in between the frequencies, allowing energy to cut right through. Here's some examples of how this could actually work and how fractals are actually able to embed within each other, and torsion fields embed within each other too. As you can see here on the bottom left, here's a torsion field within a torsion field within a torsion field, creating a fractal structure. And then also, if you look at the flow of energy as it moves around these different spirals, they can wrap around each other, adding to each other and creating a stronger structure. And with that, we're going to look at how this energy actually moves through a plasma torus and or any energetic state. And there's two different kinds of waves. There's a transverse waves that we're all very familiar with, the waves that move up and down, and then like the waves that crest on the seashore. And then also longitudinal waves, which are the waves that slide back into the ocean once they do crest on the seashore. Here's a video that shows this. As you can see, the water, as it comes on the seashore, there's a flowing back into the ocean as the oncoming waves meet that flow and then bring it back towards the seashore. This ebb and flow adds information to the field each time it crests on the seashore. Some of the properties and differences between longitudinal and transverse waves are that transverse waves move perpendicular to the wave propagation, like surface waves that eventually come to rest on the shore. Examples of these are radio waves or the surface water waves or detectable electromagnetic waves. Longitudinal waves move in parallel to the direction of the propagation, meaning the waves will come in and they flow into it. This is a compressing and a rarefying of the medium. So it's creating these interference patterns. The aspect of this travels back into the ocean and it actually is the greater medium because it's actually the longitudinal waves that actually begin to move up and down. Examples of this are sound waves and scalar waves. These carry information through the energy fields, as we saw with the foam on the ocean. Some of the properties of these longitudinal waves are they're often called scalar waves. They operate within stacks within the transverse. So think about how when the sea foam slides back into the ocean, it's going to collectively always just continue to stack as that continues to happen. So you can think of this as different sets of harmonics within any given space. And this gives you basically infinite amount of space to work within because you're always going to have more medium to compress. This allows for instant communication at both ends because when that water slides back into the ocean, the other end of the ocean is going to be affected. And you can think of the longitudinal in relation to us as being pralaya or the unmanifest, as it's not directly interactable with us, but it's very important. Um, so how do these longitudinal waves actually occur and how do they come out of these transverse waves? Well, just like how when the water crests on the seashore, it loses up and down motion and it slowly begins to slide back into the ocean. And this is called in hydrodynamics, where we work with water, a change in vorticity, meaning it's stopping spinning like this and becoming it's going from a centrifugal spin to a centripetal spin, where all the inertia is stored in the center. And this is exactly how electromagnetic waves work. And this transfer of vorticity is actually a transfer of the information. So, for instance, when those water waves from the ocean crest on the shore, those bubbles and foam are actually the sand and whatever was left over from the water that didn't sink into the sand. And then that information is shared back into the ocean. Here are some examples of how this translation of vorticity ends up propagating into the medium. As you can see here in the center graph, when this energy meets center, it begins to spiral outwards, creating a wake pattern. And as you can see here with this toroidal structure picture on the left, this is exactly what's happening at the center of a plasma torus, because that compression is exactly what's happening on the seashore, except this is happening at the center of everything as it cycles energy in through its center and out to the outer perimeter. Because whatever wasn't able to be compressed is the energy that is cycling around. But what was compressed is being squeezed out and creating this ripple pattern like that on the far right. As we talked about in hydrodynamics, this concept is called a translation of vorticity. And it's where those up and down waves get converted into longitudinal packets or longitudinal waves. And this actually happens at what we call a spark gap. And these spark gaps occur where there's a buildup of static electric charge between two entities. And then when they connect, there's a twisting of energy and a connection at the center, creating thunder, which propagates throughout the environment. This spark gap occurs pretty commonly in most things. And they tie to regions of the Earth that have been reported to have strange activity, like places in Sedona or Skywalker Ranch in the Southwest. A good rule to follow to find these places of charge on the Earth is to look for the different spots where the different platonic solids arrange on a sphere. And we'll look at this in a second. On the Earth, there are these different nodes or sacred sites, and these all align by aligning this series of shapes over here on the right onto a sphere. And then by following the different intersections, you're able to understand where electric charge or vibration or energy coalesces. And then when you visit these sacred sites, the reason you feel such an upswell in energy or a feeling of calmness is because there's a natural sharing of energy in that region. Here's a graphic showing how if you overlay the shapes onto the earth, you get all of these different points that show you where there are energetic hotspots on the earth. And then here's another set of pictures that show on Google Earth how you can actually use these different ley lines and energetic routes and magnetic lines to, plan vacations, figure out where you want to live. But these are the natural energy lines that flow through the earth. And then with that, I think we're ready to see and understand what causes an object to fall to the ground and how is that relevant to us. And why is there even the idea of a curve in spacetime? So if we recall how a plasma torus or a torus is 99 is the shape of 99.9% of the universe, we can see that this energetic and information compression is the act of creating force at its center. And as we know, a plasma torus or a torus spins energy from its center out to the outer perimeter and then back into the center. The cyclical pattern is pulling energy in towards the center of whatever is separated. So, for instance, in us, each cell is pulling in gravity as it's pulling in stimuli from the environment, bringing it into its center, and then sharing it out with the environment, which suggests that energetic flow and energetic charge exchange is information exchange. And if we look over here on the right, here's some evidence to show that the ancient scholars sort of knew this. Because if we look at the tree of life and we see that we can map the different platonic solids onto it, we see that it follows the sacred platonic solids as they go from the most complex, the dodecahedron, to the cube, to the triangle or tetracube. Sorry, tetrahedron. This path is the path that it said energy moves from the Godhead to our reality, from Keter to Malkuth. And I think it's no accident that if you break up these patterns, you can separate them into a dodecahedron, a cube, and then a tetrahedron. And then once it reaches Malkuth from the top, again, you get this implosion pattern or the reverberation through the medium. or longitudinal waves. And the way this happens is that Maxwell Planck, a famous physicist, discovered that mathematically we're able to detect or mathematically understand the smallest unit in the universe, which has been dubbed Planck length. And this smallest length is 1.616 times 10 to the negative 35th, which is an incredibly small number. But they found that at this scale, everything in our reality starts to break down and it becomes quantized or part of the quantum mechanics system. These quantum fields are, I think, actually just descriptions of the longitudinal or scalar fields. Because as we discussed, as looking back at the water waves, when those water waves hit the shore and become at rest and then slide back into the water, they are adding back into the total medium. And if you look at this at a smaller scale, using electromagnetic waves, what you find is that at certain frequencies and when energy is efficiently shared and compressed, it gets squeezed down to this smallest length or Planck length and then distributes into the field. And if that's the case, this is the quantum field. And we're possibly interacting with it all the time. And this leads us into a lot of the higher concepts that have been thrown around in physics, such as Kaluza-Klein theory, which is the concept of a 5D spacetime. Basically, this group of scientists believe that there's a fifth dimension that is actually guiding our reality and providing it the energy and also the guidance to be able to sustain itself. And there's a belief that this gravity is a process that is being played out in the fifth dimension that appears in electromagnetism, creating what we call 4D space. And that there are charged particles that are moving in relation to our environment. And then while we're not exactly interacting with it directly, it is directing how we react. Here is some graphics to show how torsion fields create gravity. Because if we look at here on the left of the one that's spinning and see that energy is constantly being pulled towards its center, and then look at this one in the middle that's got multiple going through its center, we can see that gravity or anything trapped within these fields is being pulled towards the center. Here's a picture of the Earth and us. If you look here on the left of the picture of the crust, the upper mantle, outer core, inner core, you can see that the crust and the upper mantle are positively charged, while the other layers are negatively charged, which means that the center of the planet is always pulling the outer layers towards its center. And we are actually positively charged ourselves. And the ionosphere of the planet is negatively charged, which means that we are trapped in between two negatively charged areas, giving us a region here to move around and play in. Here's an animated example of what happens as these transverse or up and down waves moves towards the ultimate small point in the universe, Planck scale. There's a meeting of different frequencies that eventually will lose their vorticity after they spin and hit each other and then spread out into the environment. Here are some more slides or pictures showing how the platonic solids do arrange in a way that allows for the efficient compression of energy. Johann Kepler, a famous scientist in the 16th century, discovered that if you look at the arrangement of the planets in the solar system and you assign different platonic solids to the mapping of these planets and where they are in the solar system. He found that if you take this arrangement of shapes, going from a dodecahedron to an icosahedron to a octahedron to a tetrahedron, sorry, to a cube to a tetrahedron, you get the path of the tree of life again. This path again is repeating across our reality from the solar system to the electric charge within atoms. This repeating pattern, sorry, I think I messed up these slides. So you can see here on different atoms and different elements that if we look at how the electrons are arranged in their different orbitals, they will take on these platonic solid shapes. So, for instance, there's the different names of them. They're sharp, principal, diffuse, and fundamental. And they will take on a spike or a single point, a cube, a dodecahedron, or an icosahedron. These suborbitals are found in every atom, and they match the amount of electrons within each shell, and they coincide with the amount of edges in each platonic solid. So, for instance, a dodecahedron has 20 of these. Here's some more graphics showing the different patterns created by the different orbitals and the different atoms. As you can see here on the top right, where they've done an electron microscope scan, you can see these patterns that are arising and creating these different platonic solid shapes. Here's some more pages from Johann Kepler's manual about how these shapes can embed within each other and create sustainable structures that are infinitely compressible and infinitely shareable. Here's some more examples showing how you can divide the elements into different groups which align with their different shapes. This is a complex arrangement of how these different shapes actually embed in each other, and you can see there's a straight line connecting all of these different shapes right towards the center. And these edges or lines all act as guides for electric charge to move through a medium, allowing it to implode at its center effectively and efficiently. Some more pictures of that. And to build on this, I want to just quickly look at these different shapes and how they allow electric charge or waves to move through a medium. And you can easily understand this by just looking if there's an odd number of sides or an even number of sides. For instance, a triangle will project energy because there's only 3 sides. The same with a pentagon. But if you have a hexagon or a square, you're only able to collect charge in the center. And these shapes make a great way to take energy and coalesce it in the center before it is shared outwards. And with that, I think we're ready to look at how this works inside of the living being. Because if we look at a concept known as piezoelectric force, which is the concept of when you squeeze something that is uniform or a fractal, by squeezing it, there's nowhere for energy to go except for outwards. So if you were to hit a quartz crystal with a hammer, you'll see a little spark appear. That's because there's too much compression that can't be shared throughout the structure, so it has to escape. And understanding that, we can look at the human body a little differently, because things like Kundalini are believed to ignite it's believed to move electric charge or energy up the spinal column before arriving in the center of the brain, where there's a collection of that energy as it slowly propagates and builds on itself. It's called an inner lightning bolt. And just like how lightning bolts, when they strike in the air and propagate and create thunder, our brains do a very similar thing. So that when we're in flow states and both brain hemispheres are working together, they're able to twist and create that lightning bolt at the center that propagates outwards. It's just like water waves as they reach the seashore or in the previous examples. These brain waves also interact with each other, creating bigger structures that exit into the environment. And with that, I think that we can also analyze that a torsion field actually has a lot of the properties that define consciousness because they're constantly moving energy out of their center into the outer environment, probing it, interacting with the other energies, then bringing it back in towards its center, contrasting what they had before, and then adapting. This cyclical process is exactly what we do any given moment. And to show how this actually would work in the brain, a man named Itzhak Bentov discovered that the third and fourth ventricle in the brain, right here, is a fluid filled sac that can actually vibrate and reverberate into the greater structure of the brain. He found that there's an energetic flow that moves around the hemispheres of the brain and enters towards the center, just like a torsion field. And when we are in Kundalini states, we're actually beginning to beat this part of our brain kind of like a drum and allowing it to reverberate into the environment. And part of that process is getting the heart to beat in resonance with that torsion field as it cycles. And here is another example of how our DNA is a fractal shape, because it turns out that if you take the dodecahedron and you continuously rotate it at turns of phi ratio, you can actually repeat and understand the pattern of DNA as it forms a double helix. Here's some more examples of how DNA is a fractal shape and how itself, because it is fractal, contains the information of the entire universe. And with that, I think we can return back to the EEG study we talked about at the beginning, where the men were recorded with EEG caps at time of death. Because it looks like if you take into account that standing waves exist within their own region and that alpha and gamma brainwaves are at phi ratio to each other, we can begin to understand that since these brainwaves are able to propagate into the medium, they are able to take all of that individual's experience, compress it, and then send it out into the greater field as a longitudinal wave. And this sharing would go across the entire universe, as we had discussed, just like how when water waves crest on the seashore. This sharing of life experience adds to what some call a morphogenic field. And this morphogenic field is considered to be the vast memory or greater consciousness of a species. And in this way, every time we take in information to ourselves, it's compressed and then shared out into the universe. And I believe that that is how rats on different coasts can learn how to solve mazes faster because they are telepathically sharing information subconsciously. And with that, I think we have a good basis to understand that a lot of what we consider to be woo is just misunderstood science because we didn't have all the pieces to understand that we are surrounded by energy that can both be intelligent, self sustaining, and invisible. And I think that this opens up a lot of abilities to explore a lot of the newer concepts such as chakras, astrology, remote viewing, Reiki, channeling, how reincarnation works, how numerology works, what our auras are, how crystals work, what are dimensions. I mean, there's so much. I think that this really will help us understand our world a little better. And here's some more examples of fractality. Here's some examples of how even the ancients understood this to a degree as they used pine cones to demonstrate the fractal nature of sharing information. Here's just a slide showing how we can use all of this information to do some really cool stuff, including creating things like UFOs. And with that, yeah, big thank you to Dan Winter at fractalfield.com for a lot of this information.
Wow. All right.